Welcome everyone to IAS 335, War, Revolutions and Terror. Last week we were talking about the long fuse of the religious, leading up to the revolution, and we had started to talk about the fiscal crisis, and this is going to be very important. But it occurred to me, as I've been reading Simon Schama's book, which is a very, very good book on the French Revolution, that I don't think I've said enough about something that it is worth pausing upon, and that is simply the changing social attitudes and the novelty of the period, the fascination with science. In many ways, it's congruent with the Enlightenment. It also helps explain why the Enlightenment generally found such an audience, a ready audience. And I do think that it is the transformation in sentiments and public attitudes that is partly responsible for the kind of panic that will occur and a kind of faith and hope in the new and the novel, that there will be a way out, something that will change everything in a way that all will be good. That there's a certain kind of optimism, which is part and parcel also of much of the Enlightenment story, that things can get better, that with more knowledge there can be social improvement. And Schama makes a point, and I think this is a very good one, and I think he makes it particularly well in his book, because a lot of books, I think, sort of override this. And he emphasizes how many changes were already underway, and to appreciate why a significant percentage of the nobles threw in their lot with the revolutionaries has to do with the fact that they too have been caught up in the new sets of ideas and aspirations and hopes that are part of the period of the age. And I'll just go through, first of all, its novelty itself. It's something. There is a real hunger for anything exotic, anything novel, anything about the world. And with the discovery of the New World, of course, much earlier, going back to the late 15th century, early 16th century, as the world is becoming in some ways more global, with the conquest of the South Americas, etc. There is really just people are intrigued about any kind of exotica, and they want to have imports from that. So, for example, a good example of that exotica is when Montesquieu, a very important Enlightenment thinker who I did mention last week, when Montesquieu writes the Persian letters. That's pretty typical. Or in the writings of Voltaire, another major man of the Enlightenment. There's all sorts of references to exotic peoples and locations when he's making comparisons. Same with Denis Diderot. He does the same, another great Enlightenment thinker. So the public is starting to see itself in terms of other kinds of ways of being, which are in many ways alien to it. I mentioned too that Marie Antoinette used to play with her friends, used to like to dress up in peasant costume, and part of Versailles was given over to being as if it were some rural, rustic area. And this is the same kind of mentality. So there's a kind of projection of an alter ego, which is very different to who one is, but in some ways that satisfies your soul about there's something else out there, and our desire for the new is being satiated in this. This in turn is going hand in hand with a real increase in reading habits, theatre habits, the music, people listening to songs and attending music. So that, in a sense, a new kind of public is being created. It's really very sentimental. And so there's all this sentimental literature that's really geeing up the emotions. And this, I think, is important because one of the things we'll notice about the revolution is the rebirth of rhetoric. Those of you that have done the course with me on foundations of Western civilization, and even my political ideas course, know how important the question of oratory was in the ancient assembly. So and Plato will take them, will be very critical of what the orators are doing because he's believing that they're swaying people to do bad things. Well, there's a rediscovery of the importance of oratory is also occurring around this time. And the other thing I think Sharma does, and the other person who does this well, is Rosenstock-Huessy, I've mentioned before. There's something about the society that is really devoting itself to spectacle, and hence the theatrical. So everything about the society is being geared up for a kind of representational understanding of things in terms of their theatrical impact. And a lot of the revolution, I think it is important to understand, especially when we get to the terror, that there is a real theatrical dimension to this. There's a real, and people will be standing around watching these mass killings as if it was just another form of entertainment. It's like a reversion to the world of the Romans when they went to the gladiatorial games. So this is kind of, I won't put too fine a point in it, but ultimately the anti-clerical fervour, I think there is a kind of pagan revivalism in there that's coming through in the kind of sentiments and habits of the French people at that time. There's also many exhibitions that are being set up. There's air balloons that had begun shortly, not that long before the revolution. So this was another new kind of adventure to discover the skies, so to speak. And newspapers, there'd been a huge readership, a new readership of newspapers. So people were being very driven by new events, by the sentiments, so the habits of the heart, so to speak, and by ideas, as well as the rhetorical representation of it. So this, I think, is an important part of the social context in which you have a new kind of public, a very different kind of public than has preceded it, even at the time of the English Revolution, a very different kind of public that you're finding. And to repeat, a number of the nobility are as fascinated by the attacks and mocks upon them and this hunger for the new that is also appealing to other members of the commercial classes. And you may recall me saying, and it is worth emphasizing, that a number of noble offices had been purchased by this new class. So that there's a kind of seepage that's going on between what we call the bourgeoisie and the noble class. They're not so radically separate, and all sorts of ways in which one can get ahead by buying an office. This has become increasingly open, and being increasingly open, this ultimately is driving a sense of ambition for transformation, and more people simply want to get ahead. And the state seems to be, the way it's managed, as we will now see when we look at its dysfunction, it seems to be a great obstacle to making things better for this great invention, because this term will become central to it, the people. But as we will see, when we follow the trajectory and the dynamics of the revolution, whether you were counted as one of the people or you were counted as one of the enemy of the people, very much depended upon which elite was in power and what was driving their tactics at any given time. And when we come to the terror, we will see that panic is going to be a really important component of the revolution. So this is funny. I just want to highlight this, that on the one hand, you've got an event in which the ideational side of it that comes out in things like the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which we'll talk about a little later, or comes out in the way the Constitution is set out. So there's a kind of ideational precision, a kind of intellectual precision. Reason is at work here. This is the instantiation of the Enlightenment. So on the one hand, you have that, and on the other hand, there's complete emotional chaos. It's the exact opposite of that. And it's that interplay between these dual aspects of the human character, which I think is a really important part of the story of the human side, of the psychology of the Enlightenment, and how this massive contradiction is driving and contained by, but also directing this event that we call the French Revolution. Okay, now at the end of last week, I had started talking about the fiscal crisis, and the fact is that the state needed more money. So let's carry on with that story, because it is a very important part of the story of what ultimately forces the king to bring the Estates General together after they had not been called since 1614. It was 1614 or 1619. Anyway, a very long time. He's forced to call them together because he needs revenue. And so it's this revenue problem that is going to be like the match that lights the tinderbox. So first of all, let's go back to the state of the finances. And in 1786, the Controller General, a character called Cologne, had announced that the total revenue for that year would be a deficit of basically 25% of annual revenue. So there was annual revenue was less by 25% than the deficit. By the way, there's many states today where that's the case. Numerous states where that's the case. So that's not necessarily fatal. The problem was, though, that there was a panic around this, and the way of alleviating the burden wasn't obvious, and there was really a crisis of faith that there was any way to solve this problem. So cutting expenditure would not suffice, and they really couldn't, because they did have large military requirements, even though their military requirements were not necessarily that much bigger than Britain or Prussia, and a percentage of GDP, Prussia had spent a lot more than France. But they also had the burden of the relative high cost of court. Remember me pointing out that nobles had to spend so many months of the year in Versailles, and they were basically dedicating themselves to a life of etiquette, genteelness, etc. So there was a need to raise taxes, but one of the problems was that, as we will see, there was such a mishmash of various taxes, and there were so many resentments, and there was such a lack of any kind of uniformity within the taxation that actually raising them in a way that wouldn't cause great consternation, or raising them in such a way that would guarantee a better and secure source of revenue. This was not easy. Moreover, the Parisians also were the highest taxpayers in Europe. One of the things that we will see throughout the revolution is the wrath of the Parisian crowd especially. It is a hugely important factor in the revolution. And at different times, it is orchestrated by elites to try and suit their ends. And at other times, so the Jacobin faction under Robespierre, as we will see a bit later, you see at once he has to stop this. He has to stop it because it threatens the revolution. Yet it's been that's actually he's been depended upon to help drive the revolution. And we will repeat the point I had made earlier of the huge importance of the Paris within the whole process of the revolution. Now, Great Britain also, when we're talking about debts, the lack of central coordination in France was a huge issue. Britain, for example, the Parliament presided over taxation, borrowing, and expenditure. Now, it's not only that France had borrowed a lot; they had borrowed heavily because of the preceding wars. So they hadn't just used tax revenue. The question was, could they depend upon others to keep lending them money to help pay off the loan. And this was where the crisis was. And in part, that has to do with the dysfunctional way in which the money is being gathered and the money is being collected. Whereas for the British, they had a parliament that was overseeing everything. And in France, there was no central treasury. There wasn't even a real annual budget. This was really, so it was remarkable when one of the finance ministers published what the public debts were, and this was seen as horrific because this was not meant to be public knowledge, and it was kind of news to the king as well, exactly what they had. No one seemed to have any real grasp on what the figures were. This is really a disaster. Now, most finances had been collected by independent financiers. As I said this before, they had purchased the right to be able to extract government revenue. So they were basically independent financial people who were nevertheless also was working for the government. But there's this very grey area of what's their private interest and what's in the public interest. They could be members of the Farmers General, so they collected a whole range of taxes, especially the indirect taxes. They, by the way, were generally quite hated. Or through buying an office of accountancy, receivers or treasurers through a government department. The Farmers General was the second largest employer in the country. So you just think about this. This is, there's basically, you could in economic parlance, you could say the Farmers General were rent seekers. They weren't really doing anything other than acting as middlemen to get money from one group of people to transfer it to another group of people. But this is the second largest employer in the country. That's not a good way to get bang for your buck, so to speak. And there was 25,000 agents with 42 branches in the province. But they could also dispense money how they liked, as long as they agreed upon to get money back that they said they would give to the crown. But ultimately, this meant, again, the king was borrowing his own money and paying interest on it. This is quite crazy, but this just goes to show the extent of the dysfunction. There was also a Régie Générale, a syndicate who received a fixed salary. So there was a risk of revenue fluctuation. This all remained at the crown, so they weren't actually ever sure exactly how much they would get, or who would be passing on how much to whom. Now, when Turgot, as Controller General, attempted to reform the system, he also found, because a number of these people were also doubling up working in the parliament, so there were all sorts of administrative incentives which would ultimately sustain the dysfunction. And the administrative incentives being, if you got a certain posting, that's great. It's central for the whole administrative apparatus of the state, and that's good for you personally. But is it good for the flow of revenue to the crown? Not necessarily. Is it good for the decision about how the money will be spent? Not at all. There's no real matchup. And there's various. So one of the stories about the lead up to the French Revolution is it's a story of different finance ministers trying to bring about urgent reforms, and constantly these reforms are thwarted. So there's no way of really bringing them about, because there's just too many interests that get in the way of the reform. Now, let's look at some of these taxes, because again, it gives you a real mishmash. One of the big taxes is what's called a tithe, property and income tax. But the nobles and clergy are generally exempt from this, so they're not paying that. And this is again one of the things about purchasing the offices. If you're a new noble, you've been pretty wealthy for whatever reasons. You've been able to build up some wealth through. You might own some kind of little factory, or you might have some land somewhere and gaining rent or whatever, but a workshop. So you've managed to build up enough revenue to become a noble. Now, one of the reasons you're doing that is because that will get you out of the tax burden. So that's why you're doing it. So this is operating. The fact that they're not paying revenue is, in a sense, a gravitational force pulling more and more people in to seek this kind of office, and also to support this kind of office, because this kind of office is exactly your way forward to improve your position financially. You can see this is not a smart thing. In basic economics, you know that the price of something is a signal. So if something's very cheap, that will send out a signal, so it will tend to attract more and more buyers if there's anything useful about that thing. And this is a big signal. This is a big signal to come and join the nobility, and then try and find a way for the kind of officers which are running the country, which the crown is dependent upon, try and find a way to not only keep it going, but expand things. Not smart. Okay, then there's the vantien. This is a direct tax on everyone, but most nobles, again, were exempt. Or they could pay an annual sum, which worked out at less than 5% on income. So that was collected by royal officials. So sometimes you hear the nobles didn't pay any taxes. That's not true. But they were doing things to ease their tax burden. And this is basically everyone was trying to find a way around it. But obviously, if you lower down the food chain, you've got less opportunity for that, and different taxes will affect you in a different way. I'll just move down to the gabelle, for example, the salt tax. This is a very big part of the story. Everybody needed salt on their food and in their cooking. It was just considered essential. And in different provinces, you'd pay different amounts of money. In different regions, you'd pay different amounts of money on the tax. So this meant there was a huge salt smuggling enterprise going on. So again, there's the issue that the tax is being avoided, so the state is not receiving the revenue it requires. But at the same time, some people who are paying it feel this is ridiculous, and they're paying an onerous amount for something that's a basic staple. But there was also a head tax, again paid by everyone, but there were ways in which the nobles and clergy could lessen their burden. There was all sorts of consumption tax on items such as wine, liquor, and again that would depend upon where you were. And again, this increased smuggling. So there wasn't a consistency around the taxation here. There were taxes on the royal domain, crown lands. They were collected by the Regis General. Again, customs duty, other customs. There was indirect tax on legal transactions collected by the Regis General, something like you remember me talking about the paper tax that was paid in the United States. Very similar kind of thing for a short while before it was rescinded. But that was you might remember that was something that really annoyed the Americans and made them turn against the British. There were indirect taxes on goods that were brought into towns. There was a corvée, so a tax paid for compulsory labour by the peasants. And then there were the tithes. This was the annual fee paid to churches by landowners. And again, this only, on top of all these taxes, this only increased the animosity towards the churches. And when we come to speak about the church in this, we need to bear in mind that although, as I had pointed out in an earlier lecture, although France had basically set up a national church, and this had been a number of hundred years by now, it set up an annual church. The fact was that over time, a huge amount of property had been passed on by wealthy people to the church. So they had accumulated a reasonable amount of property. And anyone that was in government knew if they could get that hand on that property, that was an instant source of wealth. And the only thing keeping them between that property and them as the elite of state The only thing keeping them from that was people's willingness to support the church, people's faith in the church, and to go along with that way of doing business. So you can see for a whole lot of people, there was a huge material advantage in ultimately ripping property away from the churches. And of course, the French, in this respect, were only doing what had occurred already in the reformist countries and in Great Britain under Henry VIII. So there had been a long-standing practice of the state acquiring church property to try and solve revenue problems. So I'm just mentioning that signal. So you've also got all these different ministries. So you've got a fiscal problem, but then and it's not separate from a more administrative problem at the level just of government itself. So again, remember, you've got a system of absolute monarchy. So the king needs to be over everything, but of course that's impossible. How can you have all that knowledge? You as the king are ultimately dependent upon someone that reports information to you. And one of the things that happen, and this is a thing that happens all the time in bureaucracy, is different departments, because they need a budget and they want to keep things growing, if possible, keep their positions, they will also try and manufacture the information that makes one ever more dependent upon them. And there tends to be, and this is not peculiar to what life was like with the French, only in some ways it was worse, but this is just part of bureaucracy just generally. So you've got these various departments, all in a kind of competition for favour and for resources, each one believing its department. It never has enough people, it never has enough information, it always needs more officers, etc. And they're also, there's war, there's foreign affairs, there's the navy, the king's household, Protestant affairs. Remember the Huguenots, they're treated as something differently than what the Catholics are. There's also different regions, and they're all fighting with each other to get support from the king. And then there was the problem of the ministers of the state who might be on the royal council, but you could be a member of the council of state, but you wouldn't be, because you're not a noble, and this was the case with Necker, finance minister. He resigned in 1781 because he felt he just wasn't being taken seriously enough. So he was being reduced to the role of running a department, but he didn't really have any political clout. That's no good. There was also a privy council. Their business was prepared by 80 masters of request. So again, each one is caught up in this bureaucratic little kingdom, trying to control the revenue coming its way, clientele dependencies that will support its way of doing things. Again, ultimately very dysfunctional. And so the king does not have a clear picture. And yet the system is built up, because it is, to repeat, it is an absolutist monarchical state. It's built up for there to be an all-wise, all-seeing kind of eye, someone who knows everything, when in fact they're in the dark about all sorts of things. So very often the king is as surprised as anybody else in the realm about what the real situation is. He's quite clueless, and it's not to do with his ability. It's not that Louis was a particularly venal or stupid man. I don't think that is the case. It's very complicated when you're talking about the psychology of someone in this position. Obviously, you can see those that are frivolous and completely stupid. Obviously, you can also see all the weaknesses of character, vacillation, hesitation, a lacking of firmness of decision making, that's all true in Louis, or a kind of preening vanity, a kind of easily deluded and allowing them, I don't think this is so much, but allowing them, in the case of Louis, but allowing oneself to be charmed and seduced and by those who use sweet words to get their way. So the kind of qualities that any normal person would display, and we all have weaknesses of character, every one of us. But when you're a monarch, these weaknesses, wow, they're magnified 1,000-fold. And in Louis's case, the hatred towards Marie Antoinette, and the crowd would gravitate. They would move from loving her to hating her, but generally, more and more often, she would find herself hated. And that only, again, that reflects badly on the king, that reflects badly on the crown. And her weaknesses, and remember, she's a young girl when she marries, she's in her teens when she marries Louis. The fact that, she is quite frivolous, she's playful, she gets caught up in court intrigue, she has lovers, she wants to play Rousseau, like everybody else, other educated person in the country with some wealth. They imagining themselves as like peasants, etc. I mentioned that example, but it's kind of crazy. She wants to act in the play of Beaumarchais, which is really an attack upon the nobility. These kind of contradictions, but they're abounding, and they're all in some ways taking the character of a person of great political authority, and because they're a weakness, they reflect back on the Constitution itself. They are indicative that there's a crack in the system. And ultimately, I mean, one of the things that comes out of the Enlightenment is that, and it's well formulated by the philosopher Immanuel Kant, where he says, the German philosopher who observed the French Revolution, he said, we should be able to create a constitution even for a race of devils. Now, I think that's quite mad, because I think that suggests that law can be so far and above the human heart that it doesn't matter what the human heart is. If the law is right, then we will be able to comply with it. I think that's just fundamentally wrong. But that expression ends up, I think, being very much the way in which the overwhelming majority of people tend to see politics. Now, what we're witnessing with the breakdown of the absolute state under Louis, and I've used that term, absolute state. I, the king, I am in charge of everything. But what you can see here, he's not in charge of very much at all. He's absolutely dependent upon all these other rivals, infighters, factional interests, selfish interests, and he's left high and dry. And of course, it'll be far more than the royal family that will be killed, or at least Louis and Marie Antoinette that will be killed. But what we see is the various actors who attempt to seize control of the state. We'll see one after another being sacrificed in the development of the revolution. There's nothing that they're able to hold on to, which is eventually why it will end up in a military dictatorship and then a restoration. Anyway, we'll get to that. So there were also the intendants so there's regional directors. They're reporting back to the various ministers. So again, another big subdivision, another indication of the complexity of the chain of command. And don't get me wrong, any kind of state is a bureaucratic chain of command. That's the way states work. And let's get real here too. So often when people talk about politics, especially younger people, ideology is a big part of the story. And you can see this in the United States today at colleges, and I see this all the time, and I was as guilty of this as anyone when I was younger. But people think in terms of ideology, but So should there be more capitalism or less capitalism? Should there be more socialism or less socialism, etc.? Well, to be perfectly frank, I think this is extremely shallow. It's extremely shallow. If you want to understand what's going on, you have to understand the mechanics of the state, and you have to understand the different groups that are active participants, the different players that are active participants within the state system. And ultimately, what you've got are various mechanisms in order to try and garner resources, ensure that legislation is being complied with, come up with legislation, administer officers, and so on. But when you talk of the state, you're always talking about bureaucracy. It doesn't matter what ideology you've got. It doesn't matter whether you think you're a liberal or whether you're a socialist. It doesn't matter. You've got the same thing. And that's a bureaucracy. And this was as true of a monarchy, as it is true of a democracy, as it is true of a communist country. So the question is, what and how is a bureaucracy operative? And certain features of bureaucracy are absolutely constant. They're absolutely constant. It doesn't matter what kind of regime they're functioning in. And their limitations. The limitations of the state are invariably the limitations of a bureaucracy. It is just a limited modality of action. And this is why people who really think that they can get the state to solve all their problems are absolutely mad. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that the market can solve all our problems. There's nothing that can solve all our problems. That's my position, which I've reached after a very long time. But the reason is every kind of human modality, every kind of modality of human action have got fundamental limitations to what it can achieve. And it's in the kind of action itself. Ultimately, politics requires speaking, and this goes right back to, you can go right back to the ancient Greeks, who really invent politics as we understand it, where persuasion is so important, a quality in order to draw people into a political community. And you need legislation, and then you need to back that up. So you need, but ultimately, it's a limited form of human action. At its crudest, it's simply a way of getting one lot of people to do what another lot of people get them to do. That's all it is. You cannot, for example, through political means, force people to be more creative, or more loving, or more caring, or better behaved, or more moral, and so forth. You might have policies in place which facilitate that, but you can't guarantee that you will get it. Okay, so I'm just making the broader point here, because one of the things we're going to see is we are talking about dysfunctional government here, but it's not as if that what transpires later goes from something completely dysfunctional to something perfectly functional. No, it doesn't work like that. It hobbles along. There will be certain improvements, that is true. And it is true, to repeat, that the kind of chain of dependencies and the kind of structure of incentives is particularly unsatisfying at this time. That this is, in a sense, there had to be a clearing up of the process. And there were attempts already in the offing before the revolution suggesting ways to clean this up. And one of the things that have to be cleaned up is indeed how the king saw itself. And there were nobles that themselves thought that how the king was representing himself belonged to another era. Again, remember me saying at the beginning of the lecture, all this stuff about novelty and the new and science and enlightenment. This kind of stuff also inevitably was going to impact upon how people understood state and government. And so this is in the air as well. Okay, so coming back to the intendants, various sub-delegates, they begin as a parallel administrative network to draw power away from the regional nobles. I think that was a point that I'd made earlier. It goes way back to Louis XIV. But they would be an important part of why the system was so dysfunctional. Also, regional governors and deputies still remained as military authorities in provinces. So what's happening is that, on the one hand, something has evolved, and it's evolved in order to displace another kind of authority. But in fact, it hasn't completely displaced it. So you're starting to replicate layers of authority, and where you replicate layers of authority, again, that becomes an economic irritant. It's an irritant to those people that are beholden to these different parallel sources of governance, because they can't stand it. They think, well, you're extracting money from me to do nothing, and you're doing not much more than extracting money from me. So again, this makes it very unpopular. Generally, the intendants also were understaffed and seen as inefficient, and in a third of the France had to share power with provincial estates. So there's doubling up, extra layers of complexity. We said that the government positions were generally board offices, and there are a myriad of provinces, generalities, all these other ways of doing governing and legislation that have been overlapping, conflicting borders, employed different tariffs and duties, different customs regulations, different systems of weights and measures. One of the things we'll see is weights and measures will be standardized during the French Revolution, as well as all sorts of tariffs and duties. So one way of looking at the revolution, and this is in a sense to draw out the more ongoing improvement, because I think that it's true to say that aspects of the revolution did solve certain problems, did solve some big problems. That this problem of regional spread and chaos and a lack of any kind of centralized standards of things, this will become an important part of the revolution. And it's why, as we will see when we get to it, that the federal versus the centralized system, there's a big conflict over that. And it's seen by the centralists as all or nothing. So there's no truck with federalism. Now, we recall in the United States, it's a federal system. So one can only understand why the response of the centralists in France was as shrill, as savage as it was to any kind of federalism, when we appreciate the kinds of dysfunctions that they're perceiving, which are part of the legacy of this what's going on in France. We can only really appreciate that shows us a big difference between what's going on in the United States and what's going on in France. We'll get okay. Now, I'd mentioned the Parlement before. Remember, the Parlement should not be translated just as Parliament in the what we now mean by Parliament. It's a sovereign court of appeal. As of 1770, there were 13 parliaments of France. They could make regulations and bylaws for their own areas. They could suspend general laws in emergency, but they were often rivals with the intendants. But again, this is something I'm wanting you to see. When I'm talking about the bureaucracy and the different offices, that rivalry, contestation over a sense of importance, over resources, over one's own place in the world, it's a very important symptom of this kind of social fabric, which is being rent asunder. It's being torn apart, and in being torn apart, it's leading people to take really extreme measures against anyone they perceive as their enemy. The sovereign courts of appeal, they also, any new laws had to be registered through the parliament if they were to be applicable to a region. So this suggests a certain dependency of the king upon the parliaments. And originally, going hundreds of years back, we recall that the king was always dependent upon a council, and this is really an after effect of this, that the king emerges in any kind of warlord or situation as a more or less set of equals, throwing their lot in with what they consider the best broker of disputes and the strongest, the best and strongest, but not able to completely separate themselves from him. And again, we recall the wars of the Fronde show how the nobles were resisting the kind of centralizing tendencies that the monarchy, that the crown was undergoing to try and draw more and more authority to itself, and thus ultimately trying to sever or weaken bonds of very long history that were important to its foundation. So now the king, he didn't want to be saddled with this. You know, from the crown's perspective, there's all these other new people, lawmakers or administrators, revenue collectors, etc., that are beholden to him, and he's trying to, as with a lot of the nobles, he's trying to bypass their attempt to control the direction of resources, and you've got a whole lot of new players, a whole lot of new dependencies, a whole lot of new problems that these dependencies have been created to try and help you solve. So this is how it gets to this. So the king could use what's called a leader justice, and that is he could make a unilateral decision. Very dangerous though, because you've got these dependencies, very economic position, whose social role is based upon a certain set of stability and everyone agreeing to go along with it. So because they have status within a region, because they're seen as important, creating disaffection with them is just a way of, and again, you recall that in the War of the Fronde, one of the first one was the War of the Parlement against the crown. So you have to deal with this rivalry, and they're another set of rivals to all these other state players. There are also 21 other sovereign courts with 2,300 magistrates by the late 18th century. And again, these were nobles of the road. So this was also another way in which you could buy your way into being privileged. Now, the term privilege is which we hear today a lot of in political discussion, but this idea of privilege, it's a very important concept in the French Revolution. And when the revolution is reaching its zenith in terms of its most democratic moment, which is simultaneously its most totalitarian moment, that is, the biggest moment of democracy is also the biggest moment of terror. So it's a dialectical relationship of oppositions in which they both seem to be there, but in a sense, they're both there because there's something else going on altogether. And both of these are acting as conspicuous features of something else which is ultimately destroying it, which is exactly what happens, of course. The next phase of the revolution is the undoing of that dialectical relationship. Anyway, forgive me, I'm just recollecting my thoughts here. So these are different. Oh yes, privilege. Sorry. So with this idea of privilege, basically what had been happening is everybody who can is wanting to get more privileges, and those that can't get more privileges start to use the term privilege as a pejorative, as a means of abuse. Now, for most people at the bottom of the pile, there's no privileges for them to get. But this is one of the things that will happen, is that those that steer the revolution, they are privileged. They are people that are coming from these upper classes. They're people, whether it's the upper bourgeoisie, to use that term, whether it's lawyers, whether it's professionals, but they're all people who in some way, shape or form are amongst the most privileged of that society, amongst the far more wealthy, the far more cultivated, the far more educated. But in many ways, revolution becomes an opportunity for them to settle scores with those people who they think are a hindrance to their own gaining of privilege. Obviously, they don't present it that way. They present themselves as representatives of the people. But as we will see, they're not loved by the people. They're not really represented. Some people at some time. Some people at some time. But we'll see it's a kind of social chaos. Because of the power, because of the kind of dysfunction, you could say, of the parliaments, and simply unnecessary. A character called the Chancellor Mocco abolished them, but he couldn't get away with it because all these people are now out of work. They're not happy at all. So Louis had to reinstate them. And this kind of vacillation is in part one of the reasons why Louis was, to put it bluntly, too soft-hearted. And this would be very similar with the Russian Tsar. To avoid revolution under these conditions, you would have had to be an iron-hearted, monstrous person to stave off the brutality that you had no idea would come. And although, as we will see, Louis slowly devolves power, and not with a great deal of willingness. The problem, as we will see, is he was simply overcome by events. He didn't know which way to turn, and this system was simply breaking because so many of the people that were gaining advantages from that very system ultimately thought they didn't need the crown anymore. And that, I think, is a big part of the story, that we have an absolutist system in which the absolute is really lacking. That is, the absolute authority of the monarch is not, it's nowhere near absolutist enough. And the void will be filled by a state that is more absolute than anything that any king previously had been able to dream of, really. Or maybe the most ferocious of emperors. But even then, the way in which it's caught up in daily life and the panic that's caused, this is really quite unique. And it has to do with the kind of system, the power, the kind of the capillaries of state, so to speak, the little bodies of state that get unified within this kind of chaos, and it's basically the unification is occurring through brute force. So, the parliaments of Paris, they would continue to block government fiscal policy. So remember me saying that there's a very protracted set of antagonisms between the parliament and the parlement and the crown. Holding private office, as I've been repeating, is a private property investor. You've noticed the parliament, they're a legislative body, and you've noticed a lot of these other players. We're talking about the legal class. The lawyers will be the most important of all the professional classes. They will overwhelmingly be the largest number of representatives. Wherever you look at a body of authority within the revolution, you're going to find lawyers. What do lawyers do? Remember what I said earlier about rhetoric, about staging, theatrical performance? This is what the lawyers have increasingly become accustomed to. Presenting themselves as the voice, as the spokespeople, so to speak, the voice of the people. And they're dealing with documents. They're dealing with formulation of ideas. They're dealing with lawmaking and the finer points of this. It's very, and to this day, one of the things that's happened as liberal democracies has spread especially within the 20th century, that the numbers of lawyers in every parliament of the world where you have any kind of democracy, they are by far the most represented profession of any profession. So this is telling you a lot about the kind of beast that democracy is. Now, one might also say that, one of the central features of liberal democracy is that it requires a rule of law. Well, it's true. That's true. It does require the rule of law, but whether that should be the rule of lawyers, that's something to be contested. But certainly it used to be the case, far more so than today. So I'm not talking French Revolution now, but in a sense, part of the aftermath of it, or the legacy of it. It used to be the case that you would have representatives of small business, representatives of trade unions, working class, not just trade unionists, because the very common way people get into politics today is they do a university degree. It's usually got a law component. So they've studied law at university. They then go and work for a trade union, but they've never worked on the shop floor. And then they become a political advisor, and then they get a seat. That is so commonplace. And I think it's really part and parcel of the same trajectory of the framing of political power that is really beginning in the French Revolution. And the revolution is a lot of trial and error, as we will see. But ultimately, the kind of appeals, the documentation around it, the rhetoric around it, the institutional formation that comes out of this, which becomes the bigger legacy of the revolution, it's one in which lawyers are going to play a central role. Okay, let's look more closely at the social divisions. First of all, we've said the class system is based into estates. First estate is the clergy. No taxes or few taxes and few obligations. Remember though, the clergy is broken up between the rich and the poor clergy. The second estate, the nobility. Minimal taxes, few individual rights, but also remember that the nobility is expanded significantly because the crown is needed to sell more and more offices, and more people are wanting to buy offices to gain privileges. So the nobility has been expanded, and never before had there been so many nobles as there was at the moment before the revolution. The third estate is never everybody else who do pay the majority of taxes. The wealthier ones in the third estate were dying to get out of the third estate and into the second estate. Now, within the third estate, though, there's still a wide gap between the very wealthy merchants who were not nobility but who copied their mannerisms and the poor and the land and service labourers and rural peasants. So, and not only merchants, the professionals. I think I copied this from that. You'll see there. That's a little bit simplistic, that slide, but it's in the thereabouts. Okay. Now, the first and second estates constitutes a tiny minority. Now, this is going to be very important. It's going to be very important because in terms of the mythology of the revolution, and again, mythology, remember, I might have said it last week, the word myth simply means story. So in terms of the story that gets told about the revolution, the popular story that is told about the revolution by, of course, those sympathetic to the revolution, is that you've got this tiny percentage of people oppressing the rest of the population. They are living a life of such splendor. That is the reason that people are suffering so much. Well, that is a very simplistic story. It's not that there's not a grain of truth to it, and certainly the poorer members of the society who are struggling, and especially when they've got a poor harvest, they could certainly feel that way because they do have very little. But you've got to remember, a lot of the nobles are not that wealthy. A lot of them are just living hand to mouth as well. A bit better than the poorest and the wretched, but they're not all living the life of Riley. But there are some people who are doing very, very well. And some of them are in the third estate, and some of them are amongst the nobles, and some of them are in the clergy. But if you've got a very good economic system, the fact that they're very wealthy doesn't necessarily translate into there being lots and lots of poor people. In fact, if you've got a good functioning economy, then everybody can start to enrich themselves, whether or not it's spiritually meaningful or whatever, but economically that is the case. So there's certain things that are happening socially, and remember this is prior to the Industrial Revolution, usually midish 19th century is when that really takes over. So this is still you're primarily dependent upon an agrarian base. And if you've got poor harvests, and ultimately what you grow and what you can trade, there's not a lot of room. You've got to find some extra way to get a hell of a lot more to become very wealthy. So of course you're going to have a relatively small number of wealthy people in this kind of environment. And looking more closely at this social structure, so you've got the lower clergy who are often very poor, some of them even illiterate, really from the third estate, and the upper clergy. So they're the first, bishops and upwards. Now, although the land was tax-free, this didn't mean anything to the lower clergy. The lower clergy were, generally as dirt poor and basically kept alive by their parishioners. Now, do remember, France is still a very Catholic country at this time. What we're finding is, again, in certain regions, specifically certain urban environments, and more specifically Paris, where there's a hostility towards the church. But for most people, the church is playing an essential part of life. The church are running the schools. The church are providing the hospitals. By the way, after the revolution, when they seized all the church property and they create a civil clergy, this ultimately puts back the education system and hospital services considerably, because the state doesn't have anything in place, doesn't have the resources in place to more automatically pay for all that. Because at this stage, when I say that the church is running the schools and the hospitals, that is, the teachers in the schools are clerics, a great majority are. Teachers or clergy of one sort or another. They could be nuns as well as priests, but whatever. In the hospitals, again, nuns and priests are giving their time and putting their energy into running the hospital. There's monasteries and convents, and there's various other institutions in the abbey. So they own the church is owning around 6% of the land as well. So there's a lot of wealth there, but there's also social services, and the clergy are really caught up in all this. The church collects the tithe, that's usually about a tenth of agricultural production, and they are exempt from direct taxation on its earnings. As I said, the state will want to get hold of that after the revolution very quickly, because they see this is a huge source of untapped revenue. When we speak of the nobles, we're speaking of the king's ministers, royal officers, intendants, army officers, sovereign court members, all these other purchasing, people that we've been talking about, members of the parliament, all these office holders, and they about a quarter to a third of the land, and nearly 15 to 25% of agricultural revenue. Many of the nobles financed most of the heavy industry, and they were involved in banking. Now, this is really important because there were, when I went to university in the 1970s, it still tended to be a Marxian story about the meaning of the revolution that tended, not exclusively, but tended to dominate literature on the French Revolution. I think almost no one believes this anymore. And that story was, the French Revolution was the way in which the bourgeoisie overthrew the nobility. That's what the revolution was about. It overthrew, the third estate overthrew the first and second estate. And the bourgeoisie, though, were not so much being interpreted in terms of the city dweller professional classes, but they were being understood in terms of merchants and bankers. But the problem was, as more and more information came out, as more and more research, it was obvious this story didn't hold water, because the nobles themselves were involved in the very same industries as many of the top-level bourgeoisie. They had common set of interests, which is why also a number of nobles supported the objective of the revolution. And as we said, there were a number of new nobles that were also part of the bourgeoisie. So that in a sense, that story. And I'll be talking more, so for those of you that are scratching their head and going, what to talk about Marxism, I'll clarify that later in the semester. But I would just say, when you come to do your book review, some of you inevitably will come across works that are written by Marxist historians, and you've got to be very careful in what you're reading to see whether or not really too driven by ideology. That is, that there's too many ideas that the author has just accepted without looking further into the adequacy of their truthfulness. I tend to think that Marxist explanations about this revolution are just absolutely inadequate. They don't begin to scratch the surface of what is going on. And I think they're really part of a story in which there's an attempt to change the world to make it look a certain way, which is to improve everything, and you're using a historical event like this, you're reading it in a certain way to help you get what you want. Let me put my cards on the table. I have no contribution to make to how to make the world better. I haven't a clue. It's too complicated for me. But I can tell you that I think many people who think they know what to do, they don't know what they're talking about. It's hot air. And the idea that the French Revolution can be explained along the terms that there's a whole lot of Marxist historians, and some of the stuff they uncover and discover is good, don't get me wrong. Georges Lefebvre, Martinez, Soboul, there's a stack of them. But ultimately, I think there's something fundamentally lacking, and you start to see that all sorts of abstractions are glossing over stuff where you really need facts and figures by doing that. Alfred Cobbin, Francis Furet, and in a different way, Lynn Hunt, I think are all very good correctives to that. So that, as is Simon Schama, who I mentioned before, but there's so many books on the revolution, William Doyle, there's great books out there, and that's why I want you to do the book with you. Okay. The nobles were also dominant in the art culture and the arts. So this is another thing. Remember me saying before, the fact that very often the nobles are being mocked in the arts doesn't mean that they aren't sucking it up. It doesn't mean they're not liking it. I'll give you a very good example today. The term white privilege has now become a kind of political commonplace term. I find it really difficult, and I'll just say here, I don't think thinking in these terms is going to bring any good at all. It reminds me too much of race theory of the 19th century. It's meant to try and alleviate the problems that seen out of what is seen as systemic racism. I think that will accentuate those problems, but that doesn't matter here or there. I simply mention this. What is very interesting is so many people that talk about white privilege are white people themselves. And if it was true that there was white privilege, and white privilege means that whatever you have is illegitimate, then it would also be true that being conscious of it, being aware of it, won't protect you from anyone that wishes to take property away from you because you're white and you don't deserve it. If you're thinking terms, this is why I think this is kind of madness. And it's exactly what was going on with the nobles. The nobles were still nobles, even if they could laugh at the nobility, even if they could mock the nobility. They were still extracting the benefits of their nobility from being noble. And when it suited them and when it didn't, then they play another game. Very much the way people are. The nobles also had special rights, this, especially when it came to trial. This was something that really, rankled with a lot of people as well as the tax. Now, when we get to the third estates, lawyers, office holders, merchants and tradesmen at one end, artisans, labourers and peasants at the other end. And again, within these groups, artisan, labourers and peasants, there's really big differences in how much people have. There's also an urban-rural split, which I mentioned before. 18% of the population lived in cities with 2,000 plus. That gives, so put conversely, over 80% of the population lived in places with less than 2,000 people. There were more nobles in Western France than other regions. The clergy owned more in some areas than others. There was more in the north than west or south. Very often that would also be a sign of where Protestantism had made inroads. Much of the clergy's wealth was in urban holdings and tithe collection. Most industry was small and run by artisans. Though there were mines and some larger scale operations, there were coastal town cities benefited from the slave trade, and the slave trade would be very important. And we will see a bit later how, on the one hand, you would have thought that the revolution would bring about an immediate end to slavery, and we'll see the vacillations on that question, how it does for a moment, and then it's on again, off again. Because there's an economic dependency. It's not by no means the only thing, but there's a certain economic dependency, especially these coastal cities, upon the slave trade, and the crops coming out of the slave trade. Obviously, sugar, cotton, and coffee are big industries. The peasants were the largest majority of the population, and for many of these peasants, the revolution would not mean a whole lot. It wouldn't really deliver anything very much at all. Maybe the biggest thing that was delivered was eventually, as we will see, what comes out of the revolution is a highly militarized state, an armed state, and many of these would find careers in the army. So for those, that would be a big difference. But in general, in terms of the immediate economic development, in terms of what this meant in terms of daily lives, and although, as we can see from that picture there, we can see the peasant being burdened by the nobles. And I'll make the same point when we come to the Russian Revolution. For the peasantry, it matters little when you're spending your day doing back-breaking work, and you give up a percentage of whatever you've done. It matters little whether it's to someone who's living life as a bureaucrat in the city, working for the state, or you're giving it to some noble. But the question is, you have lost some of your produce and your time. And your time is your most valuable thing. And you work long hours generally, and in good times, you would rather shorten your working day or store up your surplus and trade it. And here you have whoever you're beholden to politically is going to extract some of that. So you don't find a great deal of euphoric support from the peasantry for the revolution. Some areas were very much against it. Many more were largely indifferent. Now, and by the way, when Karl Marx is writing about the revolution that occurs in 1830 and then the coup that occurs in France in 1848, the world he's describing, the France he describes, is not that different from now. In terms of it is still predominantly an agrarian society. And indeed, even when you get to when the European Union is formed, or the European Economic Community which it initially is in the 1960s, when that is formed, you'll see agricultural concerns are the centerpiece of the European Union. That's a kind of line of continuity. So even though by then, of course, France is far less agrarian than it was in the 18th century, later 18th century. Now, there's a great deal of difference between the peasants also about how much land they own. There was a rural elite of approximately 600,000, About 4 million had their own property and owned about 25% of the land. The majority were leasing land. Many of the peasants also had to earn money by doing other things and often go into villages and doing various odd jobs or going and working on farms. So there was a great expansion of rural poor. There were landless workers, vagabonds, beggars. But generally, they bore the greatest tax burdens of tithes and militia service. They're working, going into the army. Now, the word bourgeoisie means town dweller. I've mentioned this before because when we come to the writings of Karl Marx, he will use the term bourgeoisie as equivalent to someone who holds private property, not personal belongings, as private capital, investment property. Someone who owns the means of production or sufficient money to purchase the means of production, really, but it's the owner of the means of production. This is not what the term means at the time of the French Revolution. It simply means a town dweller, and very often what we're talking about are the professionals. They were less than 9% of the population. They were mainly urban. They owned 47,000 out of 51,000 venal offices. That is telling you a lot. That is telling you a lot right there and then. And they managed affairs for nobles, so they're in the thereabouts. One way of looking at the contestation that is the French Revolution for power between power elites, and the role of the bourgeoisie and the nobles when you're talking about this in class terms like that, is that you're really seeing an intensification of the expansion of opportunity in which the old system is seen as an obstacle. And it's seen that that way of doing business is getting in the way of more and more opportunity for greater privilege. And I think that is really a key to what is happening here. It is also true that the old nobles resented the new bourgeoisie coming in. So there is that and that is going to be important. So that mutual resentment that is going on between the classes. But there's compromises and adaptations, but that is a factor. So you certainly have, some people at court that look down upon these new nobles and look at the bourgeoisie and think, oh, that's just new money, but it doesn't smell sweet. So they're broadly divided between commercial activities, lawyers, office holders, rentiers, doctors, etc. They own 6 to 7% of the land. You can see a lesser percentage of the land just generally because they're in the north. Sorry, it depends where you work. And they're divided in terms of wealth and interest, as were the nobles. Now, the Parisians form a group in and of themselves, and that's in large part, the revolution begins in Paris. And the crowd immediately begins to play an important role. So, in a sense, the faceless mob who orchestrate its energies, that go into a panic, that do something ultra-violent, they are the heartbeat, in many ways, of the revolution. There's something like 600,000 people. There's 10,000 clergy, 5,000 nobles, 105,000 bourgeoisie. And then you've got all these other people. They will provide the heart of what's called the sans-culotte. I'll talk about it a bit later. Paris, well, I think Paris has always seen itself, but certainly since the 18th century, as the centre of the universe. And indeed, you'll recall when we talked about the St. Bartholomew's massacre going back to the 16th century, that the University of Paris was the greatest institution of learning in the Middle Ages. It was the greatest higher education, the greatest university of that time. So Paris had always seen itself as the light of the world. It saw the Enlightenment, or not all the Enlightened philosophers came from Paris. A number of them did. It's where the encyclopedia was being written. All the world's knowledge in one spot, so to speak. This is where all the great new plays were being performed. where the great new spectacles were being, exhibitions and museums being developed here. Great artworks now no longer associated with the church, but just the creative genius of the respective artists. So art and culture is the center. And here's where the literati also gravitated, all sorts of writers, educated people, cafes springing up, salons, Freemason lodges, all these places where people, political clubs, they will be really important, the political clubs. All these places where people come together and talk about ideas. And Paris is the epicenter of this. It's where the Bastille will be stormed. It's where, because of it's the largest group in France, this is where the panic will be when the price of grain gets too high. This is where the panic will be. This is where there's more poor gathered together as well. So the food riots, which will be an important part of it, it all begins here. So it's bustling, it's alive, it's interesting, it's chaotic, it's simultaneous. Remember me saying earlier in the lecture, on the one hand, you've got the reasonable, the plan, the institution, which is one way of looking at the revolution, and the underbelly is this chaos. Well, Paris is the epitome of these extremities of passion, will, and intellect, all in one location, and at different moments, one trying to get hold sway over. So, we've talked about finance crisis. That's financial dysfunction, government dysfunction. Let's talk a little bit more now. Let's go back to this financial, the crisis, which, as I said, it's initially a financial crisis that then shows that there's a political crisis. And then we start to see that there's all these other crises that are happening simultaneously. But the financial crisis is, in a sense, the focal point, the flashpoint. So Cologne had attempted to raise revenue. It was Necker who disclosed the budget to the public, and this was seen as unforgivable betrayal. But it was done to try and to create some common sense, and it was done in such a way that was meant to show that things were actually better than they were. But at the end of the day, this initially cost Necker his position. It would be recalled later. And Cologne attempts to raise revenue through new land tax on nobles, but that didn't work. It broke down. So, and again, this is part of the problem, as I said. Once you start to try and solve the problem of the tax crisis, that means you've got to get your resources from somewhere. And wherever you're looking, the group's going to say, we don't want to do that. Sorry, not us. You've got enough from us. So he was replaced in the short term, by Gogol de Brion, who sought to abolish the parliament, but again, couldn't carry it on. And there was also a devastating hailstorms that led to steep rise in grain prices. Now, one of the things that also came out of the Enlightenment, because on the one hand, we inevitably associate the Enlightenment with the forces against the crown. So we see it as the Enlightenment on one side, siding with the people against the crown. But in fact, one thing that would play an important part in the revolution was that amongst the economic ideas that had come out of the Enlightenment was a simple idea that price controlling mechanisms ultimately distorted the market, and ultimately people paid worse in the long run for this distortion. Now, let me just clarify that. You're a peasant. You're making wheat, and normally you make enough that you can sell it at, I don't know, 2 sous for £5. I'm making these figures up. 2 sous for £5. You normally make that, but there's been a very bad failure. And so normally, let's say one peasant, you make a ton or two a week. I don't know how much peasants make, but a ton or two a week of wheat per harvest. But this harvest, you've only made half a ton. So that means, how are you going to, you've lost money, how are you going to make ends meet? Do you still keep selling it at that lower price? But you've done all that work. You don't want to do that. You would rather store it. You would rather wait so you can get a better price. So the interest of the people in the town who can't afford to pay more than their 2 sous, but there's others who can. They can pay 3 or 4 sous. So what should you do? Well, the free market economics people said, well, you've got to let the peasants dictate the market value, because ultimately they've only gone to work to do it so they can get a return on it. If they can't get a return, they're not going to go to work tomorrow. You'll destroy the business. And that's basically true. On the other hand, if you're in the city and you can't afford bread and you riot, that means you've got a massive political problem. So you can see that the state wants to suppress that. They don't want these riots in the city. So, not wanting riots in the city, you go back to the peasants and say, look, you've got to give us it for this price. Too bad. No, you can't please everybody. You cannot please everybody. And so the crown went from essentially supporting a centralized system in which the price mechanism was dictated, so it wasn't really a market, laws of supply and demand dictating cost. It was political expediency. And then you had these enlightened philosophers come in and say, look, if you do it the market way, eventually what will happen is, because it's the price is so high, for example, this will lead more people to go and perhaps go and do some farming, and this will increase productivity, etc. Well, as I said, there's no really good answer to this, but the one thing that we can see is that the free marketeering policies at this stage, they created havoc in the city. You're either going to have a problem in one place or the other, but this created the problem in the city, and it's the problem in the city that is driving the revolution, because there is the epicenter of social force. It's not in the countryside yet, even though there's some things happening in the countryside. There's certain eruptions of people sick of paying taxes, etc., for the seigneurial duties, that is, to their nobles that are overseeing their land. That is happening too. But they're doing it, what is occurring is happening for very different reasons. So there's not really a unanimity of purpose, even though we use a term like French Revolution to suggest there's a great concordance. Well, no, there's all these eruptions of violent behaviour, sporadically violent behaviour, that their meaning becomes integrated, but the initial purpose underlying them is not necessarily similar. It can be very dissimilar. Now, I mentioned the calling the king to deal with these problems is forced to call upon the Estates General. I'll come back to that. And there's a great dispute about its competition. And some saw Great Britain as a model to be followed. We find this again in Baron de Montesquieu, who I mentioned before. So they're looking upon Great Britain as some kind of model, because they see eventually they get a kind of parliamentary system of a sort which gives greater centralisation, coordination, oversight, and basically better governance. That's chaotic. The Necker had come back into power, so he'd been recalled, and he convinced the king to allow the Third Estate to have twice as many officials as 2 orders. And he allowed them to bring forward a list of grievances, these cahiers de doléances. These, which a lot of historians have looked at these, and there's all sorts of grievances. But one of the things that seems to come out from people who've gone to these book of grievances is there's really no sense that the place is about to explode. The grievances tend to be very specific and very local. They're not the kind of things that could be resolved through the abstractions that, as we will see, become central to the constitutional character of the revolution. And the third estate ultimately gets members of the other estates to join them. I'll talk about that in a moment, so I'll come back to that and the formation of the National Assembly. But the formation of the National Assembly that really comes about, this is really the arc here I simply want to focus upon. Fiscal crisis, need to raise revenue, calling upon the estates to think of a way to resolve the problem. The third estate, which has been locked out of power forever, now finds an opportunity. It's got its moment, and it takes advantage of that. Now, Robespierre, who is called, wrote a little pamphlet called What is the Third Estate? And this pamphlet is in many ways one of the most important inflammatory documents of the revolution. And remember me talking about rhetoric before. It's a masterpiece of rhetoric. It is meant to galvanize the rest, and this is the third estate is representing itself as the entirety of the rest of France except this small elite. But as we pointed out, and I can't emphasize it enough, the constituency of the third estate is so massively diverse that this is a kind of nonsense to suggest that there is any unity of purpose. But for those people like CA, intellectual, and then the lawyers and other professionals, writer, for these people, they see themselves as the people. They are the people. His life is no closer to a peasant working somewhere in Brittany or in the Loire Valley or wherever. It's no closer, his lifestyle, than it is to Louis himself. So there's a lot of smokes and mirrors and rhetoric in this. It's brilliant. It's a political pamphlet. It's absolutely brilliant. What is the third estate? Boom, says. Everything. What has it been up till now in the political order? Nothing. What does it want to be? Something. Well, really, as we'll see, it wants to be everything. The nobility, however, is also a foreigner in our midst because of its civil and political prerogatives. The third estate is everything, and nobility is only a word. But under cover of this word, however, based solely on the strength of false opinion, a new and intolerable aristocracy has established itself, and the people has every reason not to want any aristocrats. So here is a kind of gunshot. We don't want the aristocracy. This is signaling you have to be sacrificed. You're in the way of our political aspirations. So the National Assembly, as it will be declared, because initially the king, when he calls the estates, the king bestows his favour through the ceremonies and rituals granted to the first and second estate, and the third estate is basically shunned. And then their demands are basically cut out. Eventually, though, the king is forced to instruct the clergy and the nobles to join it. And before he's instructed it, a number of nobles and some upper clergy, led by the king's own cousin, Philippe de Galater, as he will be called, who's Duke of Orleans, Philippe II, he will be executed, by the way, in the revolution. But he will present himself as this great man of the people, as a sympathizer of the revolution, that he leads them across a number of nobles. Then they draft a new constitution, but this will break out. So it'll break out the Bastille revolt in 1789, and in the countryside with the Great Fear. I'll talk about the storm of the Bastille and the Great Fear, and in a way, the Great Fear. This is all these rumours about the king and the queen, about what they're doing, how they're going to suppress everybody, about there's going to be a bloodbath. It's all panic. And the Great Fear leads to all these riots. People are guessing, and as I've suggested, I don't think Louis ever had the bottle to do this. And Marie Antoinette was not very savvy either. They weren't good at protecting their own interests, to put it bluntly, in these crude terms of survival. They just didn't know how to go about it. Okay, let's sum up where we've been to now, and for the next 25 minutes, I want to go through a combination of the dynamic of the French Revolt, and I want to start talking about the different phases, and then I'll go more into events and the players. So there's going to be a bit of going ahead and going back. So summing up: financial system debt plus taxation problem, government gridlock problem, too many sources of governance not sufficiently unified and centralized in terms of a common purpose, social structures and social antagonisms that are part and parcel of those social structures, various degrees of animosity towards the clergy and nobles. And remember also these Enlightenment ideas. Remember saying about many of the nobles swept up in these Enlightenment ideals. Well, much of that is being directed at the clergy. Voltaire uses the phrase, I think I used this last week, crush the infamy. Crush the infamy. That's what the priests are seen as. They're just infamy. So they're just seen as bloodsuckers. And the nobles can say, look, our family sacrificed itself. Our family was there with blood and supplying army, and because of the way the army structure had worked for so long in France, they could still present themselves as military men even when they really weren't. And of course, many of the new nobles, remember, nobles of the sword, military, nobles of the road. But in some way, shape or form, any noble could present themselves as more worthy of privilege than the clergy. So in many ways, the clergy didn't naturally find itself in alliance with the nobles. They weren't any more a natural group of allies. Both of them, in a sense, had archaic privileges to the extent that they were privileged members of those groups. The enlightened ideas, the examples of America and Great Britain had already preceded it, especially America. The determination of the third estate, absolutely important. That is a political determination by some key players. There's too many of them to name them all. But as a class, what is staggering about one of the reasons for the success of the revolution in terms of, or momentary success of the revolution, is simply that there is a real desire to gain political power by all these people who are well versed in oratory and who want to make sure that they get their piece of the pie. The bad harvest didn't help. There's the panic and fear. And the other point is the hatred of the Queen. This cannot be underestimated, and we'll see a very similar thing when we come to the Russian Revolution. She was from the Habsburg Empire, Austrian, as I said, rather young and frivolous. Scandal seemed to follow her. There was enormous, there was a big scandal, there was a big scandal concerning a necklace that really she was just a complete dupe in this whole affair. And it involved a cardinal acting as a broker with a pair of grifters, crooks, trying to put into hock some really expensive piece of jewellery and trying to sell it to Marie Antoinette, and her somehow being implicated in this when she had nothing to do with it. Most people are aware of the famous phrase, let them eat cake, that she is supposed to have said, which in all likelihood she never said. For her part, Marie Antoinette saw herself as a friend and lover of the people. And at different times, for example, when the which we'll talk about in a moment, but when the women of Paris marched to Versailles and they cornered Marie Antoinette, it was unsure whether they'd kill her or not. Lafayette, who had fought in the American Revolution, you remember, and now was becoming an important player in the early days of the French Revolution, he saved the Queen's life by kissing her hand. And the crowd then erupted into applause, because if Lafayette liked her, then she was good. So then they frog marched her along with the King back to Paris, which I'll talk about a bit moment. But this is so at various times the hatred of the Queen, and this culminates, I think, the most vile reflection of that hatred was in her own when she was tried after or shortly before her death, when she was tried and accused of treason. One of the other charges is that she's committing incest with her son. Now, quite frankly, this is palpably ridiculous. There was absolutely this is absolutely a trumped up charge. But it's indicative of the fact that people were willing to accept this about her, that she was absolutely hated. And it wasn't rational. It wasn't rational. The fact she wasn't French was a big part of it. But she didn't know how to undo this. And the Queen and the King didn't know it. Okay, so the French Revolution, it consists of essentially 4 phases. And I'm going to go through, and I'll start today talking about perhaps the first and possibly the second phase. But the first phase is that meeting of the Estates General, nobles refusing to meet with the Third Estate, clergy then hesitating, wanting to go in. They then renounce tax privileges. They're followed by the nobles. So they're kind of agreeing to something, but it's all very unclear. They can't agree on a product. And the Third Estate, enough, because basically the King and these other groups are undermining the Third Estate. They declare themselves a national assembly. It has absolutely no constitutional legitimacy, except, so when it's formed, it has none. Except insofar as the King then later agrees to recognise it, it gathers post facto a legitimacy that it never has in its foundation. It becomes legitimate through basically an act of disobedience. This may have been the first mistake of the King. As I said, his cousin, Louis Philippe, would join it. And then, you see, the King instructs the nobles and clergy to join the assembly. And we know that, they had shifted the location, the famous tennis court oath, as it's called, shifted the location. This is really them setting up, them saying, we govern. But who gave anyone there the right to govern? On what basis? Retrospectively, that would all become part of the process. While all this is happening, and there's chaos is starting to brew, there's also the storming, and there's this great fear in the countryside, the panic, and in the city itself, there's a storming of the Bastille. That's a famous moment in the revolution, because that's when the first blood is shed. And the Bastille was the prison in Paris that had been a symbol of oppression. There was something like, I think it was 7, it could have been as many as 10, but I think it was 7 people in prison. One of them was the notorious Marquis de Sade, who had basically been put in there by his mother-in-law for harming a prostitute, I think whipping and cutting her. And the mother wanted to keep him away for the daughter, so she'd pay to get him arrested. Mirabeau, who we'll talk about a bit later, he had been imprisoned there. But really, it was all symbolic. It was nothing. It was nothing, and it's not like life in the Bastille was just so terrible. It's not like a medieval. You see those cartoons, or maybe that's something I saw more of in my younger days, but. These medieval idea of a prison is someone chained to a wall and they're completely emancipated and they're filthy and the rats are in there. Well, it wasn't like that at all. It was it wasn't even a place of discomfort. It was secured, but ultimately the governor of the prison, and it was being secured by Swiss guards who came, and there was this mob outside, and eventually they cut off his head, the prison governor's head. He's trying to negotiate a peace. and they release the prisoners as if this is a great moment. Again, it's a mythological moment. Everyone goes away feeling great. You know, they've done something to destroy this bastion of oppression, but it's really a nothing. King blinks. You know, what was all that about? But in the popular imagination, to this day, Bastille Day is what is celebrated in France of the Revolution. What now? The big thing that happens is in August of 1789. This is a very long night, and it's almost like one of those drunken, chaotic moments in which everyone with any idea in their head says what they does, and each is outvying the other. And the question of how one would go about implementation of these new policies, that's absolutely not in the picture. What's in the, it's all rhetoric. It's all rhetoric, but it's rhetoric that has enormous social repercussions. You're basically ripping up the whole framework of how power has been cemented, how it's acted out, of how authority operates, of how all sorts of economic aspects of the administration of the state are conducted. You're just taking it and ripping it up in one basically drunken rhetorical night. Abolition of feudalism. Now, unlike, say, in Russia at this time, Russia was very much a feudal society. France was a society in which there were still some seigneurial duties, that is, nobles got some rights, some stuff from the peasants. But it was far from being a feudal society. It was far from being a feudal society. But the abolition of feudalism, which is, in one sense, it's meant to just rip up any remaining vestiges of feudalism, but so what does that mean for those people that are living off those few vestiges? What does that mean for them? How will they be catered for? How are they going to live, get up in the morning and live? There's going to be now, big thing, equality of taxation. How is exactly that going to be implemented? How is this going to, and the sale of offices, equalised. So anyone, you might remember us talking about Beaumarchais, that intermediary between the French crown and the American and America in the War of Independence, and how Beaumarchais had written that Marriage of Figaro, and the central idea of that play was the idea that the man of genius is far more important than the man of nobility. So it's attacking nobles who appeal to birthright and heritage, as opposed to the person who's an impressive character, someone whose talents and merit mean that they should hold any privilege that is available. And this is really what this is about. Merit, it becomes a meritocracy. Now, of course, this has largely been happening anyway. There's nothing particularly novel about this. But it's all presented in such a way as if here the term is being used for the first time, the ancient regime, the old order. The old order, that's got to go. All of that is the past. We're the new. We're creating a new kind of human being. We're creating a new kind of society. And ultimately, that society, and we're going to look at this much more closely in detail, revolves around the declaration of the rights of man. We're basically a people that no longer take our orientation from God. We no longer take our orientation, or at least not the traditional God. There's still bits of deism cling to this document, but from traditional religion, from the clergy, nor from the crown. We take it from the human understanding, from human reason, the natural light of reason. And the natural right of reason gives us these notion, an understanding that we are born with inviolable rights. Now, people still invoke this. it's very hard to understand how it's anything other than something made up. It's something basically made. What does it mean? What does it mean to say that you've got rights if you're born in absolute poverty, if there's a war going on, if you're being killed, if your parents are beating you half to death? Now, it can mean one thing, and this is ultimately what it does mean. It means that the state should, so normative, the state should provide the means of protection to try and secure those rights for you, to try and protect you from that violation. But of course, that depends on the willingness of the members of the office holders of state to do this. And here's the thing that plays itself out in the revolution. The state will simultaneously be, and the flashpoint of this will be the terror, will simultaneously be the body that is most important for the protection of rights, and it will become the body that is most important for denying people their rights. Here's again this dialectic, this contradiction, and yet that's exactly what it will be. It will be the biggest instrument of terror as it will be the instrument of salvation. So the question is, if you're caught up in the machinations of the state, if you have been accused of violating the rights of man, then heaven help you, because the state is coming after you. If, on the other hand, you are the person who is executing the rights, then that's all good. But what we see in the revolution is the person that today is a protector, the person today is applying the rights, tomorrow they're going to be the one that are sacrificed. They're going to be the one that are caught up in the terror. I mentioned the Women's March to Versailles. That's what, there's various interesting things about this. The role of women in the revolution is a very interesting subject. I don't go too much into that because there's just so much to cover in such a short time. But although some men accompanied them on the way, what this shows what it was a very spontaneous attempt of women to deal with the fact that bread prices were high, and they wanted to ensure that the king would do something about it, and the only way they could eventually do this was to basically bring him back to Paris. We recall that Versailles had been built initially as a way of the king retreating from Paris, that there, over centuries, this hostility between Paris and Versailles had been indicative of the way in which power was operating in Paris through the Parlement, and the way the aristocracy, or the way in which the crown was seeking to garner a more absolutist kind of control over the entirety of the state. So not be beholden to Paris, but make Paris beholden to him. Now, king brought back to Paris, basically imprisoned. Basically, now the shoe is on the foot of those, and Louis will he'll be the first citizen initially. Louis Capet, he'll be called, an old name of the family that he had come from. That name had never been used by him or of him ever, and eventually he would become a nothing, and then he would be executed. But in the first instance, what we're seeing is the transition from an absolutist monarchy with a pretty dysfunctional state to a third estate garnishing power and setting up a constitutional monarchy. What was also interesting very early on in the revolution is rights were extended to the Jews. This would be one of the great achievements of the French Revolution. It didn't mean, though, that long-standing animosities towards Jewish people would cease to exist in France. On the contrary, much later we would see the extent of the breakout of that with the so-called Dreyfus affair. You can look that up, I won't go into that. There was also the suppression of religious orders and monastic vows. So this was the beginning of a huge change in how the church was to be understood. There was the abolition of nobility and titles by the Constitutional Assembly. And one thinks if someone could be identified, and this would happen over the next couple of years, but identified as an enemy of the people, as an aristocrat, then their land could be seized and handed on to someone else. So this could become quite a profitable way in which someone could make a fair bit of money. The clergy was forced to now take a civil oath. The clerics had to now marry, so this was a kind of enforcement of what had been, of what had been a choice in the Protestant with the Reformers. You could marry, but this was a must, you had to marry. Moreover, any ecclesiastic had to be elected, so you didn't even have to be a Christian to take part in the election of who would be the priest of the area. So this was obviously a huge hammer against the power of the clergy. And ultimately, as we'll see, it would be a way of getting hand on church property. So they had to take a loyalty oath to the state. They became state employees. The huge drop in tax revenue that came from, because that's the first thing that happened, is there's a revenue crisis. All these old ways of getting money, they're all up for grabs. You've basically ripped up the system. The church, there's all this land. That's what you've got to go for, and that becomes the first way. And money, because now there's really no money in that traditional sense anymore. So these assignats, so money now is a new kind of money, is being recognised by securing against church lands, because basically we'll pay for this when the land is sold, when we sold off all these treasures. So it's not too different. Something quite similar happens with the Russian Revolution as well, to the extent that church property is seen and church treasures are seen as an important source of revenue. So what you've got, when we're talking about revolution, you've got a massive social breakdown. I'll finish this, and I'll finish the first section. No, I won't. I'll finish here. I've been going 2 hours. That's a lot. I'll carry on next week. Thank you very much. I'll see you next week.